So this is really a great opportunity for me to be here. I will not provide a comprehensive overview of all of my work because we really want to leave time for some good interaction with the audience. But let me just kind of tee this up and tell you what I'd like to do this morning. First of all, one disclaimer in the program. It says that I'm going to talk about kind of proven, evidence-based work. And I'm not going to do that because I think actually proven evidence-based work, and you're a great example of that, right? I mean, you have a lot of evidence for what you do, is kind of really where we should be starting, not where we should be ending. So my approach to this is to say that there's a rich science out there that's moving very quickly, and we have to be kind of lovingly, constructively dissatisfied with what we're accomplishing with the best of what we're doing. That's my message. I say that as a bold challenge for all of us to embrace. And the reason why this organization is so important is you are at the leading edge of work at the neighborhood level in the country. And that, in my mind, puts a special responsibility on this community, purpose-built communities, to be thinking about where's the field going next, and not thinking primarily about, so what are we doing, and we've got all the answers. So for me, this is about using science to drive new ideas, and it's about settling for nothing less than breakthrough outcomes for children facing adversity, and not, in the world I live in, another couple of points on a statistical test doesn't kind of do it for me. It's like really breaking this wide open and changing people's lives. So what I'm going to do this morning is give you a little bit of I'm going to give you a crash course in neuroscience and molecular biology, so you'll kind of know what's important in that world, and then show you how we're using it to kind of think about new ideas. As opposed to what most of us were doing up until a couple of years ago was use it to make the case for why we should invest in current programs. So I think this is kind of really, for me, there's a lot of talk now. We're at the half-century anniversary of the Great Society programs and the War on Poverty, and a lot of the programs that we have right now you can easily trace back to that beginning. So for me, my rallying cry is our goal is not to fully fund Lyndon Johnson's programs. I mean, our goal is to kind of take it to the next step. This is the 21st century, right? So let me start with a statement that your grandmother could have told you, but it's really nice when sophisticated science and your grandmother's wisdom end up in the same place. It means that we're really onto something here, right? So healthy development in the early years. Your grandmother would say, if you get a good start, you're on your way. And so science, which has to sound more esoteric and be more complicated, is basically coming to the same conclusion that the foundation that's set in the early years of life, and by the way, it doesn't begin at birth. It doesn't even begin prenatally. It begins with the health of a woman when she gets pregnant, which is already the time of whether this is going to be a healthy pregnancy with a good outcome or whether there's a higher risk for problems. But in the early years, these are really where the building blocks are formed, where the foundations are for all of the things that we all care about, for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for our society. Educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, good health over a lifetime, strong communities, and the ability to be effective parents for the next generation. All of that has its roots in the early years, and I'm going to give you a little peek into how at the molecular level we kind of understand that that's really true. But aside from the excitement and the kind of the energy attached to this rapidly moving science frontier, it's also sitting there waiting to be used, right? So neuroscience is moving very quickly, development of the brain, molecular biology, genomics. One of the things, this old argument about nature versus nurture, how much is genetically determined, how much is environmentally influenced. From a science point of view, that is a dead argument. It's not a meaningful scientific discussion anymore because you can't separate the two. Everybody's born with different genetic predispositions on everything you can think of. But how that genetics affects your learning, your behavior, your health is deeply influenced by the environment you live in. The environment trumps the genetics. None of the stuff we're talking about is hardwired. It's all influenced by genetics. And it's not advocates at the barricades who are saying that. It's kind of crusty geneticists and molecular biologists who really are not that interested in public policy, but are saying, experience shapes these things. It's not hardwired. And it's ironic A couple of decades ago, when we talked about nature versus nurture, that was code for, well, if genetics, there's nothing you can do about it. So if it's the environment, we can make a difference. It's kind of a little bit ironic now in this 21st century science world. We might be able to change the genome easier than we can change the environment, right? That's how crazy this has flipped over. And I think a lot of you appreciate that there are many people who are going to be making a lot of money out of the use of this science to revolutionize the way we treat disease in hospitals, the biotechnology industry. And I say that with respect for what it's producing, it is revolutionizing the way disease is being treated. The same science is sitting there waiting to be used by the work that you do. And if we don't use it, it doesn't mean the science isn't there. It means we're missing an opportunity. So I am, in the next half an hour, going to kind of teach you as much as I can about this science, and then we'll kind of see if we can get a good discussion going about how relevant it is to what goes on in the work that you folks do every day. And this is across sectors. This is not just about learning. It's not just about health. It's the same science. Brains are built over time. They're relatively, at birth, you have most of your brain cells that you're going to have for your whole life. Not all of them, but most of them, but very few of the connections. So those circuits are built rapidly. 700 to 1,000 connections are made every second in the brain in the first few years of life, because there are billions of cells and trillions of circuits. But this is shaped by experience. Positive experiences build strong circuits. Foundational circuits are a good beginning for more complex circuits, for more complex skills as you grow up. And that's how a healthy brain is built. It's how everybody's brain is built. And the reason the brain overproduces at the beginning, that's the biology of cultural adaptation. That's the biology of differences in language that people speak. The brain at birth is capable of adapting to any culture, any style of child rearing, can speak learn any language in the world, and based on the environment the brain is growing up in, is developing in, it's reading the environment, it's learning how to adapt and adjust to the environment. It gets rid of circuits it doesn't need, it strengthens circuits it does need, and you're off to the races. That's healthy brain development. Now, I'm going to shift, talk a little bit about what happens to the brain in the face of significant adversity as it's developing. And in case anybody leaves before I finish, because I don't want you to leave with the wrong message. When bad things happen that affect the development of the brain early on, this is not a sentence that means it's impossible to do better later. It just means you're making it harder, because it's easier when the brain is developing its circuits in the beginning. And once it starts pruning and strengthening circuits, it's harder to change. It's harder to kind of build better skills. Not impossible, never too late, always better to start early, but it gets more difficult, okay? So for children, this is especially dangerous in children who are facing very difficult circumstances here and around the world. Children growing up in war zones, children growing up in the most desperate conditions of poverty here and in the most impoverished parts of the world. It doesn't mean there's no hope for the future, but it means all this was preventable. It didn't have to be so hard later if you'd gotten it right the first time. That's the message from biology. Okay, so Shirley, you set me up. I'm going to have to show some data, right, to prove that I really do work in a university. But there's some very simple messages here. So actually, you showed data, Greg, so I get away with that. I can do it too. So these are data taken from a study that I'll show you in a second. It was a national study, about 1,100 kids across the country, all under the age of 3, all in Children's Protective Services and the child welfare system. So every one of these 1,100 or 1,200 children at age 3 was involved in a documented case of abuse or neglect. And the question for the study was, what's the impact of other risk factors above and beyond abuse and neglect in your life? The usual risk factors: low family income, low parent education, substance abuse in the family, serious mental health problems like depression, violence. As the number of risk factors increases, how does that affect a child's performance on a developmental test at age 3? And the answer is a pattern that you see in just about everything you can possibly study. 1 or 2 risk factors doesn't kind of do you in, but as the number of risk factors increases, the likelihood of a bad outcome, whatever it is you're studying, goes up. So in this case, children who were all documented cases of abuse and neglect, who had a pile-up of other risk factors, which often kind of travel together. By the time you get to 6 or 7 risk factors, essentially 90 to 100% of the kids were failing a standardized developmental test at age 3, which means that they're already on their way toward needing special education, having difficulty in school. And this is not just an impact on their social development and their emotional development. There was an impact on their language, on their thinking, their cognitive development. The issue here is that the pileup of adversity seems to be doing something to make it difficult for the brain to develop the skills that it needs to develop. And that's a pattern that you see. You could study IQ tests, you can study reading scores, you see the same pattern. Most kids can deal with some reasonable amount of manageable adversity, but at a certain point, nobody can deal with a high level of adversity. So now I'm going to move to another part of the world. Dunedin, New Zealand, a small city of, I don't know how many people there, but about 40 years ago, a study was begun where every pregnant woman in the city was approached to enroll in a study where information would be gathered and through the pregnancy and after the birth of the baby and then following the child's life, what they say, prospectively collecting information as you go along, health information, educational information, blood tests were done, urine was collected, and all kinds of studies were done to see how things evolve over time. These data I'm going to show you come from a blood test that was done at age 31 years. So these are people who were followed since before they were born, with a lot of information about their lives. Looking at a marker in the blood called C-reactive protein, don't worry about what that is. It indicates elevated inflammation. It's been associated with a higher risk for heart disease. So think of it as an elevated cholesterol. It's something you can measure in the blood. It says you're at higher risk for heart disease. It doesn't mean you have it, but it's a reliable marker. So at age 31, those individuals who were healthy, had a relatively uneventful life history, about 15 to 20% of them had an elevated C-reactive protein, probably genetic variability. They're not all going to have heart attacks, but it's like having an elevated cholesterol, except there's not much you can do about it. It's just kind of you have that. 32-year-olds who had a diagnosis of depression, clinical depression, had higher levels of C-reactive protein, and that confirmed something that's been known for a long time. People who have clinical depression, not just kind of feeling blue, but the illness, the mental illness of depression, have elevated inflammation for reasons that people don't understand, but it's a pretty reliable marker. It goes with depression. That wasn't a new finding. The next thing I'm going to show you was one of the first times that this was found. It's been replicated all over the world many times since. Individuals at age 32 who had a documented history of having been maltreated as a child had even higher levels of C-reactive protein, higher than people who had depression where it's known to be elevated. And 32-year-olds who had both depression and a history of maltreatment as a child, 2 out of 5 had elevated C-reactive proteins. So if you're a tabloid news person, you've got a big headline story. If you're a scientist, you say, well, it's just one study. So we don't kind of, don't get taken by the study du jour that just kind of, changes everybody's life. But the way science works is the accumulation of knowledge from multiple studies over years. But there is now a very rapidly accumulating knowledge that's replicated this, that has this take-home message. There's something about significant adversity, like maltreatment early in life, that causes biological changes that don't go away. Okay? Biological memories. The individual may not consciously remember something. Let's take children who were significantly neglected or abused in infancy. So the logical conclusion people make is, well, nobody remembers anything when you were 2 years old or 1 year old, and the kids at that age don't understand anyway, so that's not going to have any long-term effects. There may not be a conscious memory, but the body doesn't forget. In cases of serious adversity, there are biological memories. Now again, in case anybody leaves before I finish, do not leave here with the conclusion that if bad things happen to you early, you're permanently scarred and you have kind of biological changes that doom you to bad outcomes. No, none of this stuff is absolutely a predictor. It's another risk factor. It's another burden to carry. It's another thing that we then have to try to figure out how to fix later, how to overcome, how to adapt to, instead of preventing this from happening in the first place and having a much easier time getting better outcomes and not having to pay as much for it. Okay, that's the message. That early experience is built into our bodies. It's built into our bodies. Okay. For better or for worse. When the experiences are positive, you build strong brain architecture. When they're overwhelmingly adverse, it can disrupt healthy development. So a little bit of a disclaimer here about stress. The concept of stress is very complicated, and it is a losing proposition in this society as something to mobilize people around. Nobody has sympathy in this political culture for stress, right? The dominant response is suck it up and get over it. It'll make you stronger, just like it made me stronger, you know? I overcame adversity. I had a hard life. I made something of myself. Other people should do the same. Don't ask me to pay more taxes to make life easier for people. That's been a dominant part of our culture since the colonial days. It's hard to think of how to change that. We are very focused here on individual responsibility. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Okay. The other thing about that is stress is not all bad. Stress is a part of normal life. Children have to learn to deal with stress. The goal here is not to prevent children from experiencing stress. The goal is to make sure that children are dealing with manageable levels of stress, and they're being helped to learn how to cope and adapt to stress themselves, and that's what building resilience is all about. We could have a whole session on resilience. Let me give you the punchline about that. Resilience is not something you're born with. We're all wired differently, so some kids are kind of intrinsically a little bit more likely to be resilient. Go into a newborn nursery and look at 20 babies, and some of them are just like seem to be more well-regulated and happy, and some are ornery and irritable and hard to calm down, and they're all healthy. It's just individual differences. But stress is built over time. Stress is modeled and scaffolded. Resilience is built over time. It's modeled and scaffolded by adults who can buffer kids against excessive stress. Not every child living under conditions of poverty is experiencing toxic stress. The critical issue here is not the causes of stress. It's whether there are adults to buffer children against the stress, to protect them from overwhelming levels of stress, and most important, to build their capacities to deal with stress themselves in manageable levels. In the most comforting, nurturing, stable families, there's still stress in kids' lives. If nothing else, going to the doctor and getting a shot, that's a stress. First day in a child care center, you don't know anybody, that's a stress. It's like, that's a good learning opportunity. But toxic stress is a whole different story. This is the chronic, excessive activation of stress systems. Just for a second, everybody here, this is a room of people who are successful adults. So everybody here knows what stress feels like and knows what managing stress feels like. Think of the moment when you have felt physically stressed. It can be anything from not being able to pay a bill, having to get up in front of an audience and give a presentation, whatever. But you know the feeling. You know that you maybe have a tightness in your neck, a knot in your stomach, perspiring. What you're experiencing is your heart rate is up, your blood pressure is up, your blood sugar is up, your stress hormones are up, your inflammatory system is activated, that's C-reactive protein. All of these things are going on, and it's good for you. It's good to have a stress response system. It's the fight or flight phenomenon, which sort of allows us to mobilize our attention and energy when we have to deal with something. It sends more blood to our muscles to run faster if you're running away from danger, or to be stronger and fight if you're fighting for your life. This is protective, this is survival. It wasn't meant to be activated all the time. It was meant to ramp up in an acute situation and get back to baseline. And when it's up most of the time, it has a wear and tear effect on the body. It accelerates aging. It increases insulin resistance. It makes you more likely to get diabetes. It accelerates atherosclerosis. That makes you more likely to get a heart attack. It disrupts brain circuits. It makes it harder for you to focus your attention, not because you're not motivated, but because your attentional circuitry has been disrupted. And so this is beginning to help us understand what is it about serious adversity that leads not only to learning problems, but more health problems later on. They're not equally distributed across the population. Poor communities, people of color, get chronic illnesses more and have a shorter lifespan, and there's a reason for it. It's not genetic. Okay, so that's very powerful new knowledge. So now what I'm going to do is finish this presentation and open it up for discussion by showing you how we're using the insights from this very rapidly moving science frontier to think about what could we be doing at the community level, in programs for children and families, at the policy level. What could we be doing that people didn't know about in 1964 and 65 when OEO and Head Start were begun that we know about now. What could we be doing differently? So I have no data for the rest of my presentation. You're now going to see what we're thinking about, what we're trying on the ground in different places where we're working. And in the true spirit of how innovation works, big breakthroughs will come after failing multiple times until we hit it, right? For any of you who are connected to the innovation world or Silicon Valley, or think about what it's like working at Apple or Google, or what Thomas Edison, who invented a whole lot of things, said, I never failed at anything. I found 10,000 things that didn't work until I invented the light bulb. This is not, in our world, we're not given a chance to try things. We start something and the funders say, show me you're making a difference. That's not the way breakthroughs happen. So I'm going to show you how we're using science, kind of say for those places where people will be allowed to try things and learn from failure, not just from success. The mantra in the innovation world is fail fast. Don't take a long time to fail. Fail fast, figure out why this isn't working, and try something different. So here's how we're using it. This is 21st century science. It's different from 20th century science. And it is really helping us to think about how we have to actually change the narrative for policy and practice when it comes to young children and families at the community level, at the program level, and certainly at the policy level. So two big themes have come out in my mind that we're kind of really trying to dig into. One is that early experiences affect health for a lifetime as much as they affect learning. As a policy issue and a program issue in this country, it's all about school readiness. Everybody is focused on early literacy, very important. Please don't say I got up here and said literacy is not important. It's critically important, but as you'll see in a couple of minutes, if you read well but you don't have some other skills, you're not going to make it in this kind of an economy. So this shouldn't just be on the backs of the education departments and the education budget. This is about decreasing the prevalence of cardiovascular disease and hypertension and stroke and addictions and depression and various forms of cancer decades later. And if you want to talk about return on investment, do the math. Do a back-of-the-envelope calculation with all the savings on special education and, of course, incarceration, which is the most expensive outcome. But think about what a 1% decrease in heart disease would do to how much money we spend on healthcare for people with heart disease in this country. It's billions and billions of dollars that could be saved by decreasing long-term health problems that start with adversity in early childhood. So that's a game-changing way to think about this. The second, which is the one I'm going to focus on in my next couple of slides, is in terms of the early childhood world for policy and practice, the basic conceptual approach has been a model of enrichment. We provide opportunities for children in programs for enriched learning experiences. We provide enriched language exposure. We provide kind of enriched interactions in good environments. Absolutely right. Great stuff. And it's very important. It's as important today as it was when we started these programs half a century ago. We also focus a lot on giving parents information, giving them kind of guidance and advice. It's pouring stuff in. It's putting in information. It's providing enrichment. The science is saying that is necessary, but for children experiencing significant adversity, it's necessary but not sufficient because we need to balance the enrichment model with a protection model. We need to protect children from sources of toxic stress that are putting pressures on their families, that are disrupting their biological development and interfering with their ability to maximally benefit from the enriched experiences we're giving them. Not everybody, and most parents instinctively do this. Most parents don't have to be taught to kind of protect their children against stresses. Okay? But in the face of overwhelming stresses, there are skills that are necessary to deal with that some people don't have because they themselves were raised in circumstances where they didn't get a chance to build these foundations either, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is not a deficit model. This is about building resilience. It's about building strength. Remember, you're not born resilient, and it doesn't come in an automatic pilot. It is built over time. This is about building resilience. So what happens when you work with scientists, if you work just with advocates, who are very important players in this, we're off to the races. Let's focus on health and not just learning. Let's focus on protection, not just enrichment. The scientists, they're much more ornery. They say we need to be more specific, like what's the hypothesis here and what should we study? So here are some of the hypotheses that are driving things that we're trying. So for starters, if we need to be building the capacity for parents and the other adults who care for young children to provide some measure of protection against adversity, not just enrichment, then what that means is that we have to build capacities in caregivers, and let's focus just on parents for now, although it applies to a lot of people working particularly in childcare. We can't just have people who are struggling with tremendous adversity in their communities. Just giving information and advice is not enough. You're dealing with violence in the community, you're dealing with the absence of supports to help you do what you want to do for your child, and somebody says it's important to read to your child, it's important to talk to your child. From the beginning, do it. Here's and then the new campaign, you're 30 million words behind by the time the child starts to school. Talk. It's not enough. Even the most well-educated, wealthiest people who go to the bookstores and buy every book they can find about how to raise their children and how to deal with behavior problems, reading a book doesn't change the way you do things. It's hard. So there's a skill-building, capability-building dimension here for effective parenting and buffering children from stress that gets to what some of these skills are, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But as we started to think about what are the skills and capabilities you need to manage a well-regulated home environment that promotes healthy development, and someone in the room, because we're very interdisciplinary, said, these sound to me like the same skills you need to get a job. People said, well, interesting. And she said, if we're going to build parenting programs, we're going to make these programs count for the TANF work requirement, the requirement to work for welfare payments, because these are skill building for employability. And someone else said, oh yeah, good luck. How are you going to make that happen? And she said, well, I'm the secretary of such and such in the state that she came from. I'm going to make that happen next week by changing the regulation. That's an example of how the power of this kind of thinking in the right hands of people who can make a difference, which in your case would be people who are running community programs. You can do things in these programs different from what you're doing. First thing may not work, but to try, make it safe to try. So then we got into this notion that there's a core of foundational skills that are necessary to be a successful adult, on which are parenting, on which is employability, on which is how you're a member of a community who's contributing in a constructive way. They're not separate skills, and I'll talk in a second about what those skills are. But then the issue comes out of what do we do at the community level? Because these improve parenting skills, which also enhance employability. But at the community level, we all know, and everybody here can authoritatively talk about how when you build a sense of collective efficacy in a community, when you build social capital, when you provide support that's meaningful, that supports families, we know intuitively that that's got to be good for children and families. But then you've got these ornery scientists who come along and say, well, how does that work? I get it, it sounds right, but how does a sense of shared support get into the body and affect the development of the brain? How does that get into the body and affect whether you're going to get metabolic syndrome and get diabetes more likely than people who live in more comfortable circumstances? So to kind of push that issue a little bit more, one of the things that we're very focused on right now, we have a lot of questions, not all the answers, but you guys could help to figure out those answers. Clearly, the science overwhelmingly says at a community level, we need to be strengthening communities' ability to reduce the sources of toxic stress that are bearing down on families who are raising children. It's so small a number of parents who are not deeply dedicated to doing everything they can possibly do to give their kids everything they need. But when you're dealing with stresses on just getting by from day to day, it leaves much less psychic energy and wherewithal to provide that kind of extra measure of protection and enrichment that helps children thrive. So this is not about, that's another thing about our political culture, it's all about family responsibility. It's all about laying it on the families. The science says families are the hugest influence on their children, but they don't live in a vacuum. And when they live in communities that support their needs, they can do what they're trying to do. And when the community doesn't provide that support, it is much harder for anybody to do that. So this is an important focus from where we're coming from on a community-based approach, is to ask, and it's a community-by-community issue, what are the major sources of toxic stress that are burdening families in this community, and what are we going to do about it? Whether it's violence, substance abuse, the lack of availability of places where parents can just get together safely and provide support for each other, that the science says is ultimately going to affect the ability of us to provide this protection for these very precious developing brains. So I'm going to end by going a little bit deeper now to give you the science behind these thinking. So what are these magical skills that I'm talking about? These skills for parenting, these skills for economic self-sufficiency. And there's a huge amount of neuroscience sitting there saying, I've got some ideas about this. Let me tell you what I know. So you can look at this slide. We know where in the brain the circuitry is for things like being able to follow and use rules, working memory, keep more than 2 or 3 things in your head at the same time while you're trying to figure something out, to control your impulses, to kind of make decisions, to kind of come up with a strategy to deal with a problem, and then kind of put a plan into action, and then go to option B when option A isn't working. These are what are called executive function and self-regulation skills. We've known about them for years. Mostly it's just people who study them esoterically. But these are the ability to focus your attention on something and keep your attention focused on it. Set goals, make plans, make decisions, solve problems, follow rules, control your impulses. They all come under this category of executive function skills. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to kind of see how these are the kinds of skills you need to maintain a well-regulated home in whatever environment you're living in, and to get a job in an economy where if a computer can do something, you're not going to get hired, so you've got to think, you have to solve problems. So back to the science. We always go back to the science. The first thing science says to us is we have a big challenge, and it has to do with this concept of neuroplasticity. Plasticity is the flexibility or the adaptability of the brain to change as it faces new challenges. So folks, this is the sad reality of what the plasticity curve looks like for the brain. It's very high when you're born. This is the biology of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. This is the biology of why every January you make the same damn resolutions about dieting and exercise. And it's not, and in fact, everybody should relate to this. It's not that you're not motivated. It's not that you don't care. But the harsh reality is that your brain, because part of this is the positive of the brain. It's pruned away a lot of stuff it didn't need. It strengthened stuff that it needed for the environment it's in. It's gotten more efficient, but in getting more efficient, it also is less adaptable. But the good news is, if you notice, now everybody, you find yourself on this curve. It never goes to 0. This curve goes up to age 70. If they had a wider screen, if it would go longer. If there was somebody sitting in this audience who was 102 years old, who learned something that he or she didn't know before, and if you went home, went to sleep, and you remembered it tomorrow, it would mean that your brain made new connections. Literally, I'm not making it up. Literally, somebody got a Nobel Prize for that. How actually brain circuits are where memory formations and simple learning take place. So it's never too late to learn something new, but it's harder the older you get. Preventing is easier than fixing later. Getting it right the first time will always get you more. And the converse. First, I'm going to talk about this from a biological point of view. The energy cost to the brain to adapt to a new challenge go up as the plasticity goes down. It costs the brain more oxygen utilization, more glucose utilization to readjust, and we all know, finish the paragraph, it costs society a hell of a lot more to kind of deal with problems that were so much easier and less expensive to fix if we had gotten involved early. So this is a sobering message because I've been talking about building capabilities in adults who not have had a chance to build some of these capabilities themselves. So that's the sobering news. It's like, get going, folks, and don't wait till later. But the interesting thing about science, biology in particular, biology wants to get things right. I mean, that's why we're still here, right? Species that went extinct got extinct because they weren't working. They weren't adapting to their environment. Humans have an amazing ability to adapt to their environment, even as many of us have also this uncanny ability to disrupt the environment and poison the environment. And we, back in our minds, we say, oh yeah, but we'll figure it out. We'll figure out how to fix that. There's an adaptability that's real. So here's the opportunity. Mother Nature is saying, if you blow it in the early years and you didn't do what you needed to do, I'm setting biology up to give you another chance. Because this is what the development of executive function skills look like on a lifespan. It's the part of the brain that takes the longest to mature, because it's the part of the brain that is most different from all other animals. This is the part that is uniquely human, these higher level functions. So this is the curve for executive functions. It has its steepest rise in the period from age 3 to 5. So if you think about those skills I talked about, this is, again, your grandmother knew this before or your aunt or your mother knew it, or your grandfather knew it, or your father knew it, before the scientists knew it, because if you ask them, what's the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old? A 5-year-old can pay attention longer, can sit still better, can control his impulses better, can follow rules and directions better than a 3-year-old. It's not, that's all executive function skill, developing the ability to do that. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination also to see that that's as important as literacy for being able to succeed in school and in the workplace. Okay? So this period, but also you see it begins in infancy. It doesn't like wait till age 3. So even in the first year, we see social class differences in behavioral tests and in brain imagery of children who live in very chaotic, disorganized environments. In the first year already, there are differences in their ability to focus their attention. Way before they're talking or anything else, their ability to focus their attention is already affected by the environment. And think about the fact that we're now into this big kick that we're starting early, pre-K for 4-year-olds, and as if that's early. It's better than 5, but for the most disadvantaged kids, to start at age 4 is to ignore 4 years of critical brain development, where the neuroscientists say, what are you thinking for the most disadvantaged kids? Why are you congratulating yourself that you're starting at age 4 when you've already lost 4 years and even more by things that are happening that were preventable? But there's this other blip. From age 15 to 25, there's another acceleration of development of executive function skills. This is the stuff you hear about when people talk about how, in late adolescence, early adulthood, there's also another period of increasing myelinization and other development of the prefrontal cortex, which is where these skills are. This is the stuff where people talk about how the brain is not fully formed in adolescence. Most people know that. But this is, again, not about motivation. It's not about how well you teach kids. There's development still to take place. So here's the window, age 15 to 2 windows here, age 3 to 5, beginning even before that, huge amount of development. How does it happen? It doesn't happen on automatic pilot. Your brain doesn't automatically figure out how to follow rules, control impulses, solve problems. It learns it by adults who are raising you, who model for you, and help you learn how to follow rules, figure things out, solve problems, focus your attention. If adults don't have those skills well developed, the kids can't develop them. If the kids can't develop them, when they grow up, they don't have them as well as they would have if they were developed. So here's the window to start focusing on skill building, because we know how to strengthen those skills. We know how to do that. But in most programs, we're giving parents advice and information instead of doing skill building, which for the same nickel will also help them be better qualified to do more education and get better jobs. That's the promise. That's the opportunity. This is not a doom and gloom message. It's the only doom and gloom is, why are we sitting around just giving out information and advice? So I'm going to end with this kind of take-home message about what's organizing our thinking about how to create a new framework for, everyone talks about 2-generation programs. Everybody's talking about intergenerational stuff. It's right, but it's not new. It's not new. Head Start had this brilliant new idea of involving parents in programs and focusing on building parent engagement and parent capacity. And as recently as a few months ago, I was at a meeting that I never want to go to again, of a big plenary session on how do we engage parents in programs. I can't stand that discussion anymore. For 50 years, we've been asking, how do we engage parents in programs? What makes anybody think that if we just keep asking that, somehow a magic answer is coming? How about starting with, maybe we should start thinking about engaging parents in terms of what they need for their lives, rather than why can't we get them engaged to come and listen to us give a lecture about child development, right? So for us, and this is a hypothesis now, this is a working model, and it doesn't require like one test to figure it out, but I'm pretty persuaded by what the science is telling us that if we really want to achieve breakthrough outcomes for children who are facing significant adversity, then we have to start to transform the lives of the adults who care for them, and not just think that we're going to somehow bypass those adults and do something magic for the kids. And for this audience in particular, you know this, you could give this talk better than I can. If we want to transform the lives of the adults who are taking care of young children, we have to transform the communities in which they live, because adults can't just kind of do this in isolation for themselves. So this is our website. We have a lot of material on that website that translates very complicated science for non-scientists. These videos and others are on there. Take them down, use them as materials. Feel free to go to it. We've got time left for some Q&A, so let's kind of open it up. There are some mics, and let me end where I began, which is to thank you for the opportunity to be with you here this morning. So thanks so much.